Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be doing a deep dive on something that's been making headlines. Ohio's new law that affects transgender students and bathroom access.
Right.
We're looking at an Associated Press article that's titled, Ohio Governor Signs Bill Limiting Bathroom Use by Transgender Students.
Yeah.
And this was published on November Day 2024.
Okay.
So get ready because we're going to really unpack all the different complexities of this bill and then think about what could happen because of it.
Yeah, it's a really hot button issue. And I think what makes it even more interesting is that it's not just happening in Ohio,
Right.
This is part of a much bigger conversation about transgender rights that we're seeing all over the country.
Yeah, and you can even see that tension just from the headline, like limiting bathroom use.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds pretty simple, but I have a feeling there's a lot more to it that we need to talk about.
Right.
So can you just give us the basics of what the bill actually says?
So basically, the bill says that students from kindergarten all the way up to college in public and private schools have to use the bathroom and locker room that matches the sex they were assigned at birth.
Okay, so that means if a student identifies as transgender, they wouldn't be allowed to use the facilities that match their gender identity.
Exactly.
And I noticed right away that the article said there's no way to enforce this bill.
Right.
So how does that even work?
That's a big question a lot of people have about this law.
Yeah.
The article even talks about how not having a way to enforce it makes things really confusing.
Right.
It's hard for schools to figure out how to make this law work if they don't know what to do if people don't follow it.
It seems like that could cause a lot of problems. Like, wouldn't different schools end up doing different things?
Absolutely. And we might even see some schools using the law unfairly against certain people, which is a big worry.
I bet this is going to end up in court.
Most likely, yeah.
So the article also said that there are people on both sides of this issue who feel very strongly about it.
Yes, definitely.
So who are the big groups involved in this?
Well, on one side, you have groups like the Center for Christian Virtue, who are really for this bill.
Okay.
They say it will keep kids safer, especially in bathrooms and locker rooms.
So they're coming at it from a place of wanting to protect all the students.
Exactly. But then you have groups like the ACLU of Ohio who are completely against the bill.
Okay.
They think this bill will actually put LGBTQ plus students in more danger and violate their privacy.
So it sounds like both sides want to protect students, but they have very different ideas about how to do that.
Exactly.
I also noticed the article mentioned that there are some exceptions to this bill.
Right.
Like for school employees or in emergencies or when someone's helping a young child or a student with disabilities. How do you think those exceptions will actually work in a real school?
That's hard to say because the article doesn't give us much information about that, like what counts as an emergency in a school and how schools make sure everyone's following the rules fairly. There's just a lot of room for different interpretations, which could lead to even more confusion.
So even with these exceptions, it seems like this bill could have a big impact on transgender students.
Definitely.
And this isn't just happening in Ohio. The article talks about how 26 states have passed laws that either restrict or completely ban gender-affirming care for minors.
Right, and it's important to clarify what that term means.
Yeah.
Gender-affirming care includes all sorts of things to help transgender people live their lives the way they feel inside.
Okay.
So that could be therapy, hormone therapy, or even sometimes surgery.
So are these 26 states basically saying transgender youth can't get any of those things?
That's pretty much what it means, and this whole issue is going to be decided by the Supreme Court.
Wow.
They have a case about Tennessee's ban on gender-affirming care, and whatever they decide will have a huge impact on the whole country.
It seems like everything's riding on this case.
In a lot of ways, yes.
And it's not just about health care. The article says there are lots of states passing laws about where transgender people can use the bathroom and whether they can play sports.
Yeah, this is definitely a topic that's getting more and more attention.
And the article mentions that even people like Donald Trump are part of this conversation. It sounds like his campaign speeches have added fuel to the fire.
It's definitely made things more heated.
And the article says that if he gets back into office in 2025, we could see even more laws about transgender rights.
It's a real possibility.
So we have states making laws of possible change coming at the federal level, and all these arguments happening in courts and communities all over the country.
It's a lot to keep track of.
What do you think are the most important things to keep in mind as we try to understand all of this?
Well, the biggest thing is that we're not just talking about laws and legal stuff.
Right.
We're talking about real people's lives, especially transgender students all over Ohio and the country.
Yeah.
These laws could really change their lives in big ways.
and it feels like we're at a crossroads where we don't know what's going to happen next.
I agree.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the one thing I'm sure of is that the fight for transgender rights is far from over.
Mm-hmm.
We have some people pushing for more inclusion and others who want to take away rights.
Right.
And how this plays out will have a big impact on a lot of people's lives for a long time to come. And it's not just bathrooms or healthcare, you know?
Right.
It's really about how we as a society decide what individual rights are and how to protect them, especially when those rights bump up against people's strong beliefs and values.
It's a tough conversation to have for sure.
Yeah.
I keep thinking about those exceptions in the Ohio bill.
Yeah.
Like they're trying to find some kind of middle ground, but I'm not so sure it's working.
Yeah, the exceptions just show how complicated this whole thing is.
Yeah.
It's like lawmakers know that there are situations where you need to be flexible, but the bill itself doesn't tell you how to do that.
Exactly.
So instead of a real solution, it feels more like they're just trying to patch things up.
Right. And that leaves a lot of room for people to interpret things differently, which, as we said, could lead to some people being treated unfairly.
Exactly.
And it seems like the people who support this bill and the people who are against it are basically speaking different languages. So how do you even start to bridge that gap?
That is the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's easy to get caught up in all the strong opinions and emotions, but I think we need to step back and really try to understand where each side is coming from.
Okay, so how do we actually do that?
Yeah.
How do we stop just talking past each other?
I think it starts with recognizing that this is a really personal issue for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
For transgender people, this is about who they are, how they see themselves, and their right to live as their true selves.
Right.
And for people who support these bills, it often comes down to worries about safety, privacy, and their traditional values.
And both of those perspectives are valid, even if they seem to clash.
Absolutely. The hard part is figuring out how to have a conversation where everyone feels respected, even when you disagree. Instead of trying to win the argument, maybe we need to focus on understanding each other better.
It's easy to say that, but it feels almost impossible to actually do, especially when everything feels so divided these days.
It's definitely not easy, but I think it's really important if we want to find solutions that work for everyone involved. It takes empathy, being willing to listen, and being committed to finding some common ground, even if it's just a little bit.
You know, you said earlier that this issue is really about how we define and protect individual rights. And I think that's something we can all agree on, no matter what our personal beliefs are.
Exactly. At the end of the day, this is about making sure everyone can live with dignity and respect, no matter their gender identity.
Right.
And finding that balance between individual rights and what's good for the whole community is something every society has to figure out.
You know, this reminds me of other times in history when people were fighting for their rights, like the Civil Rights Movement and the fight for marriage equality. Those were really long and hard battles. And it seems like the fight for transgender rights is still going on.
I agree. Progress isn't always a straight line.
Right.
There are always ups and downs. But I think it's important to remember that all these movements for equality are connected. They're all about understanding human rights better and creating a world that's fairer for everyone.
That's a really good way to think about it. So where do we go from here? What can we do to make sure this conversation keeps going in a positive direction?
I think the most important thing is to stay informed and involved.
Okay.
These issues aren't going away, and they'll keep being talked about in courts and state governments all over the country.
So we need to pay attention to what's happening not just in Ohio, but everywhere.
Exactly. Read articles from different sources, listen to different opinions, and talk to people who have different views than you, but do it respectfully.
So it's about being good citizens and participating in the process.
Exactly. And don't forget that you can make a difference on your own. Support groups that share your values, contact your elected officials to tell them what you think, and fight for policies that promote inclusion and equality.
Those are all really practical things we can do to actually make a change.
Yes. And even though it can feel overwhelming sometimes,
Right.
it's good to remember that we can all do our part to shape the future.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember this isn't just about politics or laws. It's about people's lives. It's about creating a world where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued for who they are.
Exactly.
Yeah, it really hits home that we're not just talking about legal stuff. You know, we're talking about real people and real stories and real lives that are being affected by all of this as we wrap up our deep dive. What are your big takeaways? What stands out to you as really important?
You know, I think for me, it's The uncertainty around this new law in Ohio, like not having a way to enforce it, just creates this big question mark. This kind of ambiguity that I think could have some pretty serious consequences. Like we talked about the possibility of lawsuits in different schools applying the law differently and even discrimination.
Right.
But even beyond the legal stuff, I keep thinking about how this uncertainty will affect transgender students just trying to live their lives.
That's a really important point. And we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
The main points of the bill, the arguments on both sides, the bigger national picture.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it all comes down to how this law is going to affect individual people.
Exactly. And we just don't have all the answers yet.
Yeah.
You know, like how will schools actually make this law work if they don't have clear instructions? What's going to happen to transgender students emotionally and socially? And what kind of new legal battles might we see as this all plays out? These are questions we all need to think about.
It's a lot to consider. And the article doesn't give us easy answers, but it does help us understand this really complicated issue.
Definitely. And it makes us ask deeper questions. I think no matter what our personal opinion is on this issue, we need to have these conversations with empathy and a willingness to listen.
Right.
It's about seeing each other as human beings, even when we don't agree.
It's about looking beyond the headlines and the politics to really understand what's at stake here.
Exactly. And I'd like to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Okay.
Think about how this new law could affect not just transgender students in Ohio, but people all over the country. How might this change the lives of these students, their families, and their communities? And what bigger changes in society and the law might we see as this issue continues to unfold?
Those are really important questions, and I hope our listeners will keep thinking about them.
Okay.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into such a timely and important topic.
My pleasure.
We'll see you next time.